All right, everyone, thanks for coming out. Thanks for the organizers for giving me a chance to present today, and thanks you to everyone for coming to this still relatively early talk. I do appreciate it. So what I'm going to be talking about today is a portion of my master's thesis, which I completed in 2018 at the Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin. The work was entitled The Social Logic of Pompeian Space, and I used various space syntax methodologies to analyze the Insula of the Menandro in Pompeii. This paper presents specifically the analysis of the Lararia, which are household shrines that are found throughout the insula. So just to situate ourselves, I'm going to be talking about material from Pompeii, which is a city. Thanks. It's like a movie now. A city in south-central Italy on the Bay of Naples. Because of the eruption in 79 CE, there's an incredible level of preservation, which makes it the perfect case study for visibility studies like the one that I'm doing. The Insula del Menandro itself is a discrete city block in the south-central portion of the city. It was excavated first between 1926 and 1933 by Amedeo Maiori, but most extensively published by Roger and Leslie Ling and Penelope Allison starting in 1997. The insula contains 11 discrete property units, 7 of which are multi-room houses and are the focus of my study. I discounted the single-room properties and tabernae because of a lack of spatial complexity and relevant material. Luckily, each of the 7 houses that are in my study have at least one Lararium, which makes it the perfect case study for a paper like this. So what I'll try to do is argue that the Lararium throughout the insula were placed so that they were visible to the inhabitants while still remaining somewhat hidden to visitors and outsiders. So before I get into the results, I guess it helps. I can't see anybody now. Before I get into the results, just a little bit about space syntax. So space syntax and visibility graph analysis, which is the specific methodology that I'm using, are a body of really more modern architectural theory that is used to analyze architecture quantitatively and look at sort of movement and perception within. And funnily enough, there was a talk yesterday which went through the different analyses and rated them and recommended visibility graph analysis the least. So hopefully in my talk I can disprove that at least a little bit with my results. So I want to go through the steps. Is there any way to turn the lights a bit down?
Yeah, you can turn it off.
Can we do it off? Because a lot of the slides are mostly just black. So I'm going to go through the steps with this specific house, which I promise you is there, house 1011 in the insula. We'll run with it. So I started by drawing the insula in AutoCAD, so I have a vector drawing of the insula, which I could then start the analyses. You first start by overlaying a grid over the plan. I used one that was about 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters, which gave me the high enough resolution that I could see the detail that I wanted without taking hours to process. After that, you fill in individually the area that you want to analyze. So I did each house individually, and the tool fills in all of the accessible area in any given house. And from there, each grid square, the isovist for that position is calculated. The isovist is like a 360-degree viewshed, and each grid square has this calculated, which is then displayed in a color gradient showing what is more or less visible. So red is the most visible and blue is the least visible. And something that I'm going to be talking a lot about is visual emphasis. So you can see how in some of these smaller, less visible rooms, the higher levels of visibility sort of spills in and lands on specific parts of the room or the wall. And so I call this visual emphasis, and I take it to mean that these parts of the room were more visible from the outside than necessarily the darker blue parts of the room. And in the end, I had this data set, essentially all 7 houses analyzed individually, but I've stitched them together here just to show everything together, and I've added the red lines to demarcate property boundaries. So what am I going to be talking about? Lararium is this household niche that's fairly common, probably throughout the Roman world, but most of our examples come from Pompeii because of the level of preservation. And there are these small niches or paintings dedicated to the lares. The exact understanding of what a lares is was debated even in antiquity. Opinions ranged from deceased ancestors, restless spirits of the dead, associations with the Greek idea of the hero, but the freedmen and slaves who are most often tending to these shrines seem to see them vaguely as benevolent ancestors or deities. And so they're found both outside throughout the city, usually at crossroads, and also throughout many houses. Within the house, they're most often found within kitchens or cooking spaces because they are associated with the hearth and received cooked offerings, but they're also found in other spaces throughout the house. They've actually received a fair amount of attention in literature on Pompeii, but most of this literature has focused on dichotomies, typologies, looking at whether or not they're in traditionally public or private areas of the house, what type of iconography they have, whether or not they're fairly simple or fairly luxurious examples. So there's been this focus on trying to divide them as much as possible. And what I'm going to try to do is draw on the similarities that you see in their placement and visibility to try to understand what their maintenance and presence had in the house. So there are 8 Lararia in the Insula del Menandro, one in at least each house. 2 are in the largest house, the Casa del Menandro, for which the insula is named, and I've circled them here in red. The first group that I'm going to talk about are those found in kitchen spaces. They're the most usual. We have 4 examples here. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through each one, but I have individual slides for them, which I'm happy to show at the end if people have questions. So the one in house 1011, which is fairly representative of the group, this space back here is the kitchen, and you can see the niche marked in red, and you can immediately see how the visual emphasis falls almost directly on the wall that the niche was built into. And so while it may have been slaves or servants working in the kitchen preparing the food, maintaining the shrine, giving the offerings, it's still placed so that the most visual emphasis falls from the outside space onto the niche. So even if you're not working in the kitchen, it's still visible and present as you're moving throughout the house. And this is the same for all the examples in the kitchen. So there's a variety in spatial organization and locations of the kitchen, but in each case, this is the Lararia is built into the most visible part of the room. And you can imagine how you could just as easily build it in any of the other less visible walls, but it seems to be intentionally built in this very specific spot. So the next group that I'm going to be talking about, I call backspaces. They're kind of hard to define, but they're not necessarily small private rooms like the kitchens, but they're still fairly far away from the entrances. And the Lararia in house 7 and 8 fall into this example. So in house 8, the Lararium is located at the very back in this room, which is a garden. You can see it on the picture here. And while that may have been still a fairly visible open space, I've included this isovist here from this point there with the niches to show that apart from a very thin sliver that passes into the hallway, it's really only visible from that garden space itself. And this is even more interesting when you realize that this room is a triclinium, so a reception space. People would have been coming from the outside there. But the way the architecture works, this is the door to the room, and this is a window into the garden. So you can move through the house into this back room without ever actually catching sight of the Lararium. So it stays hidden in that regard. The other example is in this room in house 7 here. The excavators actually labeled this room as a triclinium as well originally, but the role of the room seems to have changed at the time of the eruption. So what excavators found here was a bed in the corner with an adult and an adolescent skeleton and a few personal belongings in the room. And the house in general was under a state of restoration and renovation. And so the actual function of the room at that time seems to have changed to a slightly more personal, private one, which is interesting because this Lararium is not built within the entire sort of artistic scheme of the room. It's inserted fairly haphazardly into the wall. You can see in this drawing here that there was an existing fresco that they just kind of destroyed and put the Lararium into. And that, I would argue, happened at the same time that this room changed function into a more personal one. So you can see how even though these rooms are not typically what you'd expect for the placement of Lararium, because of their spatial organization and function, it actually fits quite well into this idea that Lararia were very personal for the running of the household, but not necessarily for the public. So the last group that I'm going to talk about are Lararia in very public spaces, which again might seem to go against the argument that I'm trying to make, that they're very personal. So in house 2-3, you have it right in the entranceway, and in house 4, it's this lavish edicular structure in the corner of the atrium. So these would have been unmissable to anybody entering the house, as well as visible from most of the central areas of the houses. But what's interesting, these are the only 2 Lararia with closing mechanisms for their altar space. So excavators reported in house 2-3 that there was some sort of wooden door structure to close off the niche. And in house 4, they actually were able to make a plaster cast of the wooden lattice frame that would have closed off the edicula. So in this way, even though they're in very public spaces and they would have been unmistakable as Lararia, they were still given the same importance of privacy that some of the other examples that we saw had in their spatial location. And so they still fit this idea quite well. So I guess what I've tried to argue is that we shouldn't be looking for differentiations or dichotomies between these examples, but rather that across the various locations that we find them, their organization, it seems to imply that they had a very personal role for the household, and that they weren't only located to be seen from one specific location. They had very dynamic placements throughout the entire insula, so that as you're moving around and going about your daily business, you're constantly catching sight of these shrines. At the same time, they're hidden from visitors and people who may not know either where to look or may not be brought into these specific parts of the house. So in this way, we have this really interesting breakdown of the usual public-private dichotomy, which is so popular in Roman archaeology. And instead, there's this interesting duality that's both visible and present, but also hidden and personal for the inhabitants of the house. And I think this conclusion, this visibility that the Lararia were afforded, is something that can only be really seen with analysis like visibility graph analysis. Thank you for your time.